Welcome, everyone. My name is Shannon. Thank you for joining Snow Isle Libraries for Facts Not Fighting, How to Talk About Misinformation with Stacy Wedlake from the Center for an Informed Public. In an increasingly polarized society, it can be hard to discuss misinformation, whether the conversation is online or around your dining room table. In this workshop, we'll go over different approaches on how to talk with others about misinformation and its effects on sensitive topics in a clear, compassionate way. Before we begin the presentation, we would like to acknowledge the original inhabitants of this area, the Snohomish people, and their successors, the Tulalip tribes. Since time immemorial, they have hunted, fished, gathered, and taken care of these lands. We respect their sovereignty, their right to self-determination, and honor their sacred spiritual connection with the land and water. We will strive to be honest about our past mistakes and bring about a future that includes their people, stories, and voices to form a more just and equitable society. Let's take a moment to tend to a little housekeeping. Keep your microphones muted until it's your chance to speak so everyone can hear the speakers. Feel free to use the chat for questions, and we'll also use the chat on our end to share any links to any resources and websites mentioned today. And after Stacy's presentation, we will have time to ask her some of your questions. So please feel free to submit them in the chat at any time, and we'll get to as many as we can. Finally, if you'd like to turn on captions for this event, you can find the instructions in the chat. And without further ado, let's introduce today's speaker. Stacy Wedlake is a research scientist at the University of Washington's Information School's Technology and Social Change Group. Her research focuses on how libraries and organizations support community technology access and digital and information literacy. Before coming to the Information School, she taught adult basic computer classes with local and international organizations. Hello, Stacy. Thank you so much for being
Welcome.
here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation and happy to um, have this share some information and have a conversation with all of y'all afterwards. And but before I open up my slides, I just want everyone here to kind of think back to a situation where you heard someone say some misinformation, or you saw something, maybe it was in person, maybe it was online, and think about how you felt when you heard this. And then think about what you did or didn't do afterwards. Like, what were some of the questions and things that went through your mind on how to react? And then how did it go based on that? So even if you took no action, like how did you feel about it afterwards? Or if you did take an action and engage with somebody, again, like how did that experience go for you and how do you think it went for the other person? So I just wanted, kind of just, take a moment and think back to find it, kind of pick a time or two so it's in the forefront of your mind. And I think that'll be helpful as we go forward to make it a little bit more, some of these things a little bit more concrete to your particular situation. Um, and then now I am going to fire up my slide deck and then share it with y'all. And so just take a moment because this is always a little bit clunky as I make sure that I'm sharing the correct things. And okay, I'm sharing my sound. Okay, and then all right, great. So we all can see the title slide now. And my name. So yes, I'm happy to be here today, and we'll go ahead and get started here. I'm just gonna briefly review what we're gonna talk about today. And when you thought back to that that maybe that situation that you had with somebody else, maybe like I've done this before when I heard somebody say something incorrect, is I like whipped out my phone and like bam, fact check. and it didn't go well. And typically people don't respond well to that sort of interaction. And so we're going to kind of break things down a little bit more for you. Um, and so first things first is I want to make sure we have a set of shared definitions, and talk about and then touch upon the fact that we are all vulnerable to misinformation and kind of in some basics of why that is. And then going to talk about kind of a mindset about being a scout when you approach these conversations, and I'll explain what that means later on. And then more into detail about like how to mindfully approach these conversations, specific things maybe you could do, some ideas of things to say. But, unfortunately, I'm not going to give you like a magic like phrase or a magic approach to every situation. But hopefully these there'll be like a toolbox of sorts that'll help you going forward. And then yes, we will definitely have time for question and answers. Okay, so again, just want to talk about two words that get thrown around a lot: misinformation and disinformation. So kind of again, take a moment, think to yourself, like, what do these terms mean? And you can just think about it in your head. What does misinformation mean? What does disinformation mean? And then I'll give you a definition. So first up, misinformation. So misinformation is information that is false, but not necessarily intentionally false. So a kind of a handy way to kind of think about this is that think like mistake. So mistake, misinformation. So when somebody says something that isn't true, you know, you don't know if if they know that that's incorrect, or and they're just lying to you, or is this something that they do believe and just incorrectly believe. And I think that most of the false information that we encounter in our lives is is a mistake. It's misinformation, right? Somebody's not intentionally trying to deceive you, but sometimes they do. And so that's what disinformation is. It's false or misleading information that is deliberately shared for a reason. And these are typically like financial, political, reputational. I mean, this happens like in advertising all the time, right? Like they're not supposed to, but we've often, seen a commercial of something and think like, oh, this is going to like be the magic thing to get the stain out of my, my couch. And, it doesn't work quite as well as like as shown on TV. Um, um, and so as a way to kind of a way to kind of remember disinformation, you can think, deliberate starts with D, as does disinformation. And yeah, so somebody said that like, disinformation, we often hear about it in terms of like political context. And so this can be something that is, shared, where you have like political actors trying to interfere with other nations' elections, for example. I think that comes up a lot with disinformation, but it can be beyond political too. Somebody trying to sell you something to a financial scam, for example, is a type of disinformation. So these terms do mean two different things, but often in what we're going to do here is we're going to use misinformation as an umbrella term. So we're going to just use the word information today. We're not going to use the word disinformation. And the reason why I'm doing that today, and the reason why that's often used in a lot of the work that we do at Center for Informed Public, CIP, or other folks kind of use this, is because you don't often know the individual that is sharing that misinformation, like what's in their heart. Like, I don't know for sure unless I can trace this to, a specific like political actor or a scammer, I can't necessarily tell. And when you're online and you see all this information, you can't really tell the difference between mis and disinformation most of the time. Um, and it kind of, and something that starts as disinformation often ends up getting shared down the stream as misinformation. So I know this is a kind of a lot on the screen, but I really love this little diagram from the U.S. Surgeon General. They have this nice little toolkit that I'll be sharing. I have the link to that I can share later on. And so you can see in the upper left is you have kind of like the disinformers, the disinformation of people. So the people that are deliberately creating disinformation for, a variety of reasons. Like it could be just to like fool people to get their money, or, for some other cause. And then as you go down the line, you end up with, people that are like sharing or posting something from a disinformer, and maybe they don't care if it's true or not, but it helps the political cause that they are care about or the social issue that they believe in. And so they don't really care either way. They're just going to share it. And then as you go, you have people who are, legitimately believe this information that they're sharing, and they believe that they are, helping by getting that information out. And some of these people are like what they use the term like oversharers, like they will share everything like very indiscreetly. And then other people are kind of just like, oh, do it occasionally. And so I think we are all, depending on who you are, I'm assuming that there's no like, disinformers as part of this call. But I think, there's probably a mix of people that maybe you share a whole bunch online, or maybe you really you try not to share information. But this can also happen offline as well, right? Like we have lots of relationships, we communicate with others in lots of different ways. And so we might be sharing misinformation face to face, over the phone, in community meetings, in lots of different formats. And so what we're going to be talking about mostly is situations for interacting with people offline, but definitely some of these tips can be used in online settings. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is a little bit later. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. But before we kind of get there, it's really important to just touch upon the fact that we are all vulnerable to misinformation. We're all vulnerable to believing it. We're all vulnerable to sharing it. And I think if we all take some time, we can think back to when we have believed something. And this could be very innocuous, or it could have been something that was more serious. Like, oh, I was telling everybody that there was a new episode of my favorite TV show out tonight. Like it's something very innocuous. Like, that's a mistake. Probably people aren't going to be harmed too much, maybe slightly disappointed. But then sometimes there's more consequential things like sharing like an incorrect, like a news story that was like a parody from a parody site, but it was actually but you believed it to be true, for example. But before I get further, I do see that there is a question that's related to what we're talking about. So I'll just pause for a moment. So this question is what about simply asking questions needing proof? Is it neither misinformation, not disinformation, or just inquiry? So yeah, definitely that we just like asking questions. So there's a lot of other kind of ways of like information, can fall into different categories. So of course, not everything is either mis or disinformation. And the way that you're describing that, asking questions, and is would fall outside those bounds if it's done in good faith. And asking questions is actually part of an important part of the approach to talking to somebody about misinformation that we'll talk about later on. Um, our vulnerability around misinformation is heightened now. So it's always been true. We've always, oops, sorry. Um, this has always been true that we are vulnerable to misinformation, but the current information ecosystems that exist have made us even more so. And because some of these factors is just the speed and scale that we are experiencing information and the way the social media works in particular is makes it so we have a lot more mental work to do than we used to. And so first and foremost, we are just inundated with information. And I mean, I don't think I need to really go into this and explain this to y'all, because y'all live in the same world that I do, where sorry, I keep accidentally bumping my keyboard. We are getting notifications from our phone, from our email, from our computer if you work a desk job. There are, and it's just, and the rate that it comes is very quick. And I think if anybody's, I know a lot of people still watch like a nightly news, like from ABC, NBC, etc. Um, there will be like 5 stories or something on like a 30-minute broadcast. I used to watch that with my parents every night, and there would be, but now there are, if you spend any time on your phone, you can quickly scroll through like a whole newspaper's worth of headlines in, 30 seconds. Again, getting all this when you're on, and get different apps, like you're getting these different tiny bits of information that are coming at you very quickly. So it's a lot to sort. It's a lot to sort through, and it can, like I've done this thing where I like will talk to my husband like, oh, I saw a headline about this, but I didn't actually click or read on the story, and so I have like this much knowledge about it, but I'm still like, it gives me this impression that I actually know something about it. And so that can lead to accidentally believing misinformation. Um, and so oops, I'm just having a hard time with my keyboard today. So this really goes into confirmation bias. So this is a psychological tendency that we all have. And so it's where we can each take and see the same information, but we view it differently based on our own beliefs. So it's really what we should do is, when we see information, ideally we would see it like 100% objective, and then see the information and then decide what to do with that information. But what is our natural tendency to do is that we make the information fit into what we want. So as an example for me, so I am a parent with young kids, and I read information on like parenting and, how to be a better parent. And if I read a article that is describing behavior that I do, and I'm like, oh, this is a great article. Oh yeah, this is based on this research study is very strong. It's got good methodology. The person who wrote this article is great. Like I will automatically look for things to validate. Now, if I read an article that is, maybe giving me suggestion, like saying I should be doing things that I'm not doing, then I will, I have a tendency to want to look for flaws in their, like the methodology, how they collected the data. I will like maybe if I'm feeling like really in a mood, then I'll like search the author and look for other articles they've done. It gives me ways to like not value as much, what they're saying as much. Um, and so it takes work for me to like view this information more objectively. So, um, and if you're not sure if you're kind of like, do I really do this? How much do I do this? This example is not going to work for everybody, but a lot of people do watch sports. So, this photo is from a Seahawks game from a few years ago. And so if you know you are ideally you should see this scene, maybe you've watched the video, and you objectively will like, I will determine the facts. Is this a touchdown? Which, for those of you who aren't American football fans, that's like the arms up is a touchdown sign. And or is this was this incomplete interception? And then there's you see one ref is doing the hand cross. And this I like this example because actually like the call on the field was so muddled that there's actually two different calls. And so um, looking at this, so is it possible for someone to look at this objectively? Well, it's possible, but it's very difficult, right? Because if you are a Seahawks fan, then you're going to want that to be a touchdown. And so you will look and you will look for and watch the replay and look for all of the reasons why that should be a touchdown, considered a touchdown. And you can actually tell, I'll go back to the other picture. So this game happened here in Seattle, and so you can actually see like all of the fans like with their arms up saying like touchdown. Um, and if you were like a person who didn't know anything about football and you happen to be there at the game, you'd be like, oh, okay, obviously it's a touchdown, like everybody says it's a touchdown. But if you're a Packers fan, you're gonna be like, no, 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 that's not a touchdown, interception. Um, so it is, this is part like what makes us a fan, right? Like, you are a fan, you're watching the games with a very kind of deliberate, like, watching it through your own lens and wanting to see everything that your team is doing is correct and the other team is not good. So again, confirmation bias, it is, and there's lots and lots of examples through in our life, in our lives that we can think of that if you are, if you, a cycle, if you bike everywhere, you're gonna like, happen to notice all the terrible drivers. But if you drive and you don't like bicycles on the road, then you're going to happen to see all the times the bicycles are breaking the rules. I could go on and on. But this makes us more vulnerable to misinformation, because if we see information that fits our beliefs, our worldview, we will be less critical of it and be more likely to believe something without some more deliberation or skepticism. And then the other thing is that repetition entrenches belief. And so if you see and hear information more and more and more, you are more likely to believe it, even if you didn't believe it at the beginning, because it makes it seem like all these other people believe it. And that are, again, the information ecosystems that we're a part of and the information environments that we're a part of, that it can amplify. So, a piece of information gets shared, and then, one friend shares it. And so you see it from that friend, another friend of yours shares it. And so you're seeing it again when that friend shares it. You're seeing all the likes and comments. And so it makes it seem like that this is a extremely, a widely held belief, and that will it makes it easier for you to accept it, or it seems like you should accept it. But maybe that little the little community of people that believes that information is actually quite small. But it seems much larger because of the way that we are in our environments. And these are other communities as well, not just online communities. So all this is to say that really kind of step one of how to talk to people is to try and be aware of your own biases and beliefs um, as before you enter in conversations, and to come with an understanding that again, you are also vulnerable as well, and that'll put you in a good frame of mind to have a conversation with somebody. Um, so next up, I'm going to try and play this video, which is always a little dicey for sharing things. The video might lag a little bit, but we'll give it a try. And if this is a big fail, I have some slides that summarize information too. But so we'll give it a shot. And I'll turn off my video to see if that helps. Sorry, there's an ad. I'll skip it.
So, I'd like you to imagine
Oops, sorry. Sorry.
for a moment that you're a soldier in the heat of battle. Maybe you're a Roman foot soldier, or a medieval archer, or maybe you're a Zulu warrior. Regardless of your time and place, there are some things that are constant. Your adrenaline is elevated, and your actions are stemming from these deeply ingrained reflexes rooted in a need to protect yourself and your side and to defeat the enemy. So now I'd like you to imagine playing a very different role, that of the scout. So the scout's job is not to attack or defend. The scout's job is to understand. The scout is the one going out, mapping the terrain, identifying potential obstacles. And the scout may hope to learn that, say, there's a bridge in a convenient location across a river. But above all, the scout wants to know what's really there, as accurately as possible.
Okay, great. Sorry, I'm trying to advance now. No, just a second. Sorry.
And in a real, actual army, both the soldier and the scout are essential. But you can also think of each of these roles as a mindset, a metaphor for how all of us process information and ideas in our daily lives. And what I'm going to argue today is that having good judgment, making accurate predictions, making good decisions, is mostly about which mindset you're in.
Okay, so the video is longer. I'll share the link. But this her talk is titled, I think, why you feel like you're always right, but sometimes you're wrong. And I really appreciate this kind of different way, this the soldiers and scouts kind of breakdown. And I think we've all been in conversations with somebody who it does feel like they're just trying to attack you. And maybe sometimes, I've been the soldier, I will admit, sometimes I just, I am, as the slide says, you're really your goal is trying to make some ideas win, your own, most of the time, your own ideas. And that you're trying to justify your beliefs more than anything, rather than discover what's true. Because that's what's more comfortable, isn't it? Is to have your own beliefs validated. So that is one approach to having a conversation, but that's not going to get you very far, except for maybe make you feel smug at having quote unquote won the conversation. Another approach is to be the scout. And so, as she said, you're trying to get an accurate picture. You're curious, open to what you're going to find. And again, you'd rather help than win the conversation. So, so that's good. Be curious. Well, like let's get down into some more of the nitty-gritty here. And so this step three is, really kind of a way to more mindfully approach the conversation. And I mean, just like mindfully, like with intention. And this framework that I'm sharing today is based on a couple of different sources, which I have links to, and I'll share in the chat once I stop presenting. And this is a non-linear framework. So there's, unfortunately, again, it's not like a step-by-step, step one, step two equals success. But the first kind of surrounds everything is stop and I'm going to go through like more of this in depth in just a second. So stop and consider. And then you can see that there's arrows that go to these different other kind of not quadrants, sections, understand, inform, and connect. And again, you can, the conversation, you should always kind of stop from the point of stopping and considering, and then you can enter from understand, inform, connect, and kind of move about in whichever way makes sense based on the person and the topic and the conversation that you're having. So first of all, some helpful some ground rules is really the goal here should be to preserve your relationship with this person. Again, I think that most of us have had, relationships that have been strained by different really deeply held opposing belief systems, strained by misinformation. And sometimes the relationships have been, I have, damaged relationships by the ways I've tried to approach these conversations. So as you're thinking of steps forward, really is, really the relationship is the important part. And that opens the door for you to have the conversation. The other is next is to really get one-on-one and offline if possible. Publicly shaming somebody or embarrassing them is going to make them shut down. So if this happens in a group of people, getting them aside, or again, maybe not, if you see something that they're posting online, not like, going public on their feed about something. And then, and again, I think these conversations do work better if they're in person or if like over the phone, if all possible, because they're complex. The other thing is it's important for you to cite sources that a person trusts. I mean, they're not, if everything, people have trust in you, and, people have trust in different information sources. And you're going to have a hard time getting anywhere if you're starting with something that somebody has a distrust in. And know that you're probably playing the long game. There are, few situations where you are going to have somebody change their mind from one conversation. Maybe if it's something, more lighter, or simple, something that's not connected to like a deep core belief that they have or perspective, then yeah, you might solve everything in one go. But what's much more common is that you are, building, kind of building a bridge over a period of time. So going back to that framework, let's talk about that first kind of the big encompassing step, stop and consider. So this should be kind of the first thing you do, and then at any point you might kind of jump back to this step. And first is to recognize your own emotions and make sure that they are under your control. So because again, sometimes what people say can be very, can make you feel very angry and upset. And all those feelings that you're feeling are valid, but it's up to you to control your actions. And if if you're kind of that triggers your more soldier kind of mentality and you go kind of blazing into the conversation, it's probably not going to go very well for either one of you. So again, recognize the emotions, make sure that they're under control, make sure your actions are under control before proceeding. Next, is at the right time. Is this an urgent situation that you need to be, dealing with right now? Is somebody going to be harmed, in the short term? Or is this something that you can, work, does this conversation need to happen right now? And maybe even if it doesn't need to happen right now, maybe it's the right time. But again, it's good just to kind of to know like what are the stakes here? And then what's your capacity? So, this is very related to about your feelings. Like at this moment, can you be empathetic and not judgmental? Can you be a scout right now? Or did you just have like a really long day and you're utterly exhausted? So, and then, are you the right person? Are you trusted to this person? Are you going to, if you have like a kind of a long-standing kind of I can't say the word, but confrontational relationship with this person, maybe over this topic, then maybe you may not the right person for to discuss this. And then how should you proceed? So based on this, how should you proceed? And it may be to not have the conversation and to disengage. And that's fine. And so again, at any point, you might want to jump back and think about these questions. And then at any point you may decide to exit the conversation. And maybe you'll come back another time, or maybe you decide that that you will not. So next up, we're going to talk about the understand kind of mode. And so really you want to listen to learn why they believe what they do. Listening builds trust. And then it also helps you to know if this person is willing to engage. So maybe you're ready to engage on this topic, but maybe they're not. Maybe they're so heated about something that they're not going to be in a place to be able to talk. And so as part of this listening is asking open-ended questions. So not only does that help you show the other person that you're listening, you're deeply listening to them, but it also, again, makes sure that you're understanding what they're saying. And so as an example of something you could say is, what I think you're saying is this, is that right? And so just, kind of repeating it back in your own words and getting confirmation. And maybe they'll say yes, or maybe they'll give you some more information to clarifying. And then, with this is like try to understand, where they're coming from. So maybe not focusing on the exact content at first, but oftentimes this is connected to a wider issue and how they feel. And with this is you do not want to minimize how their fears or worries or any, don't say, like, oh, that's so silly. That's going to shut people down. And this is all kind of laying the groundwork for you to understand them better, and then also for building the trust. And then, it's helpful to find common ground. So as you're listening, as you're kind of thinking, learning about where they're coming from, where do you connect on this, and where do you overlap related to this issue? And maybe it's not directly, but but you can find pieces where you do agree, and then you can that gives you a place to build off from there. Um, so that's really, again, that'll become, and you'll continue to you'll build off on that common ground later on as well. And then again, you want to be empathetic with them, and like let them know that you understand, like in that. And if somebody is like, and if you can say, if they're like kind of confused or concerned about something, you can say that, like, yeah, it's very worry. I've been worried about similar things, or I have a hard time finding good information on online as well. And so again, and this all helps build the connections for kind of moving forward. So let's kind of see an example of this. Oh, sorry. So as an example, so your friend just got diagnosed with a chronic health condition, and they have shared that they believe a cure is being sold online that will help them, and they are planning on spending a substantial sum on this money, excuse me, a substantial sum on this particular cure. And let's say in this situation, you don't know anything about this. So you don't know if this cure will be harmful to them, quote unquote, cure will be harmful to them, or if they'll just be out of money. One, you can ask them to see what they've seen online. And so they can pull up if they saw like something on social media, or if they found it from like a web search. So then you can kind of get a better understanding of what they're actually looking at. You can talk to them again about a struggle that you've had figuring out trustworthy online like health information, which could be online or offline. I mean, I think we all have had some experience with that, just not sure what to do, getting contradictory information. And let them know, like, tell them how frightened they must be. And that you will help them find information, and let them know if there are a friend, family, like let them validate that you are there for them, for not only looking for information, but then also as part of being this the health condition. And so this might be the end of the conversation for now. Maybe you could like sit down with them immediately and start like looking up information, or maybe it's something that you feel like you would be better equipped at helping if you go off and do some more research yourself, and then you could come back to it, to the conversation. Again, it kind of it depends a lot on the particular situation. So the next piece is inform. And so this is where you are, giving them information that is going to be contradictory to maybe what that they're currently believing. But you want to present this information in a way that is compatible with their prior knowledge. So like you need to kind of build off of like what they already believe, already know, to make it feel more accessible and to them. So you want to point to credible sources, but again, this can be challenging sometimes if people are, if you two disagree on what are credible sources about the particular topic. But hopefully, about enough about them that you're able to you can navigate that. And one way to do this is, you verify with trusted people So one thing is like co-verify, which was briefly mentioned in the last scenario, where maybe you're actually like sitting down with the person and like doing searches together. I mean, that could be online. It could be like going with them to like a librarian, or like to, if this is like a medical thing, like going with them to like, if it's a close personal family or friend, like going with them to a medical provider to ask questions, going to somebody else that they know in a community. Maybe you're not the one that's actually co-verifying with them, but maybe you're directing them to somebody that you know in their community that they believe and trust and that knows something about this information. And then another approach to do is you can try a truth sandwich. And I'll explain what that is. And so this is more of a way of presenting information. And this is if you're looking for like potential like online, like, if you want to figure out how to like respond to somebody like within like a more of a text space, I think this would actually work quite well. So this is based on this emeritus Berkeley professor of cognitive science um, and linguistics, George Lakoff. And so what you do, so this is, oops, okay. So you start with the truth. So the truth, it's kind of a little bit of a misnomer because the truth is your bread. But you start with the truth. So the truth, you always want to, the first frame kind of gets the advantage. So you want to lead with the truth and then reference the lie or misinformation, but you want to avoid amplifying specific language. And I'm going to give an example here in a minute. And then you say the truth again, and maybe in a slightly different way. And you always want to repeat truths more than lies. So again, going back to the fact that, we tend to believe misinformation due to lots of repetition. And so in this case, you're repeating what is true. Okay. So let's give it a try. So this is, so you have a friend who's like, oh, you should throw away your Stanley Cup. It could give you lead poisoning. So this was some misinformation that was shared going around online, I think earlier this year. And for those of you who don't know, who was confused, like me, it's not the Stanley Cup like the hockey trophy, but it's like actually like a kind of it's a type of a water bottle. Okay, so this friend believes that Stanley Cups can give you lead poisoning. So you know something about this, or we'll go look it up. And so you say, so this is the truth. So you start with truth. So the cup manufacturers did say that a small amount of lead was used on the outside, but it can only be exposed if the cup was damaged. And then you reference the lie. I heard on social media that cups had dangerous levels of lead. I got scared too at first. And then go back to the truth. However, scientists have agreed that regular use of cups pose no risk. Here, let me share you a link. And then you can pull up a link to like a fact check or a news article that talks about this, the fact that your water bottle is still safe to drink out of. So that is yes, in this situation that is we can say this: if somebody still has distrust about the manufacturers, maybe you don't want to lead with the manufacturer's one. Maybe you want to focus on like how scientists or emphasize that so again, depending on where people's levels of trust are and distrust are, you can maneuver based on that. And so then the last piece of this is connect. And we've already kind of been laying the groundwork for that throughout this process. But one thing that's important to do is to de-escalate any kind of potential hostilities, big big emotions that are getting away in the way of the, having a, thoughtful conversation. And it's just de-escalation is the reduction of like, hostilities between different groups. And so you can do this lots of different ways. Sometimes it's humor. Like, I don't know, I don't know, hopefully we've all like, I mean, I know I've definitely been in like an disagreement with my spouse or with my kid, or my kid's mad at me or something. And if somebody can make each other laugh, then it kind of brings down the temperature. Um, and then we can kind of restart things. But another way of another approach to that is, um, you know, this is another example. I think you're coming from this perspective. And so again, you listened and you have an idea of like where they're coming from. And I can see why you think that. Here are some things that I think about when I'm considering the issue. So again, you're not attacking them from this, and you're again validating some of their their beliefs, maybe larger beliefs not connected to this piece of information, this particular misinformation. And then again, going back to like sharing your struggles around times that you have believed or fallen for misinformation, things that you have, mistakes that you made and the impacts that it had on you. Again, you don't want to come from this place of like where you're, the all-knowing person coming down and lecturing the other person. So again, you want to, this builds a connection with them. And then, using inclusive languages and inclusive language, including emphasizing any shared identities that you have. Where, maybe you're both, mothers or your siblings, or, you're part of the same religious community. And so some other language, some language that you can use to kind of, for sharing is, I understand, I've been confused too. It's hard to know what to trust online. And that it helps it helps then you explain your own reasoning and own experiences. And going back to like about health, if you can talk about like your own like health journey. I personally, like my daughter, when she was born, she had like a very mild like health condition, and I was very worried, and I went and like found out, and I got like sucked into like looking up all this information, and really all the information I needed was from her provider that would steer me in the right direction. And so, and this just, it helps emphasize, really you want to like emphasize your shared values. Personal stories help emphasize and highlight the shared experiences and values that you have. And again, so this ties right into this, inclusive language. So it's making sure that you're impacted the same way, how, you're negatively impacted by, by whatever is happening. And then again, some of the shared language examples, again, going back to shared identities, you're emphasizing the connections to that person, our community, our families, we, us. And because having a shared identity connects so closely to beliefs. And so by emphasizing the connection you have with somebody, then you can, see how you can look for other connection points in your, in the beliefs and the information that you're trying to share. So to kind of remember this approach, so stop and consider, and remember you can go back to that step at any point. And then you're in these conversations, you're wanting to understand, you're wanting to inform them. And so you can try using the truth sandwich if you like. You can work with them to search for information. Like maybe you don't know, but maybe you're just like, that doesn't sound in your head. You're thinking, that doesn't sound right. So maybe, you want you and the other person can, you can co-verify together and learn together. And throughout this, you also want to make sure that you're connecting and building those connections, with the other person, because these conversations happen from a place of trust. Um, and that's part of the reason why we talked about wanting to preserve the relationships as well, so you can continue to have these conversations about this particular topic or about anything else. So again, so just as like a swoop, big picture overview. So how to talk to people. So first, really important, be aware of your own biases, viewpoints, perspectives. Remember that you have you've believed false information before, and you have shared it with other people. And that, maybe even you wish that somebody had taken and done this, had a conversation like this with you at some point. In a kind of mindful way. Two, be a scout. So don't come in trying to win a conversation. Come with openness and curiosity and trying to find out information. And making the correct decisions together. And then again, going over that approach of always making sure that you're kind of aware of your emotions, and they are, and you have control of the actions and the words you're going to say. And then at that point, then you can understand, inform, and connect. So thank you so much. I know there's maybe I think a few questions in the chat we haven't gotten to. There might be some others. I really appreciate all y'all coming and listening on a Thursday evening. I do have I have a bunch of this whole presentation is built upon really amazing work done by other people, some folks from Center for Informed Public, but that others elsewhere too. And once I stop sharing my screen, I can also drop some links in the chat as well, and make sure that Snow Isle gets all of this as well. And then also, I did want to share that there are also some other resources. So if you're interested in this and like, I really want to, I want to learn more and practice more. So first of all, there is this organization called Braver Angels, and they have a bunch of stuff. They're really focused on, building connections and depolarizing, people and communities, and helping people talk to one another. And they have free e-courses on how to interact with people in difficult situations. And you'll see like some similar kind of languages and approaches to what I talked about, although but everybody kind of has a slightly different take on things. There is this Take One Small Step program that is from StoryCorps, and it brings people with different views to record conversations, so then they can get to know each other better, and with the idea of people with sharing their perspectives on when they have very different perspectives on a particular topic. And then there's an organization called Living Room Conversations, which connects people within communities and across differences, and so they can build trust and understanding. And if I remember correctly, it's so again, people with different viewpoints and perspectives. It's another way of getting folks together and talking to one another, and again to build more shared understanding. So thank you again. I'm going to turn off my share here and take a sip of water.
And while you take a sip of water, I'll go ahead and go through some questions. Let's see here. Oh, I copied the wrong thing. That's okay. We had a question very early on from an attendee who wanted some advice. She was told, let's see here. When asked to read something, I was told in the past. It sounds like this person was trying to share other resources with another person, but this other person is just not interested. He thinks it's the work of the devil and won't read anything. So, is there any advice you could give to this person on how to bridge that gap?
Yeah. Yeah, that's so hard. I don't know. Did I mention this enough that this is difficult? Um, and so I think, the advice that I would give, I mean, there's a few different ways of, I think, potentially approaching this. Is that is to, make sure that you're like focusing on maybe one thing and like kind of really, and maybe, I don't know, maybe it's even like you feel like you want them to, believe like a particular sort, like maybe it's not even about like the information that is like you're trying to change, but maybe it's like you want to be able to share this information source without them, calling it the work of the devil. And so maybe that's like the bit of misinformation that you're actually like trying to, like, that's the first step, maybe. Um, and and I think and I think related to, even if you decide that that's not the tactic you want to try, I think it's finding other people that you can, like, not to gang up on this person, but like, you can tell, maybe like starting off of like, advising them to talk to this person, or, or asking, can I like, and maybe if can I, would it be okay if I, talk, ask them to talk to you or something like that. Or again, maybe if you're good enough friends, you can ask them to like, try to approach it if you think that that's going to be, um, yeah, taken well. So I think that that's some advice I would give in that situation. I would also actually, I might also take a look at the the Braver Angels e-course here. I'll put the link right here in the chat.
Mhm.
Um, the Because they do, I think, talk about, because I believe their e-course has something about like what to do if you're kind of talking with somebody who, I think they call it a gladiator instead of like a soldier, but kind of if that sort of mentality. And so that might be helpful because that person sounds like that may be where they're at. So yeah, I would, yeah. But good luck. And it seems like they're lucky to have you because you're trying. So
Thank you. Um, Somebody else mentioned that they really enjoyed the presentation and they would like a copy of all the links.
yes,
Um, so yes, we will make sure that the links
yes,
get to you.
yes, yes, yes. And here, let me, yes, and I understand, yeah, the links weren't
Not
accessible.
easily clickable. Yep.
No, no, it's not. I know with all the technology, I wish that we would like so, but I'll copy and paste a few things in that's last slide here. And actually I can do that right now too. So you can oops, that link did not show through. So yeah, and if y'all don't know, there is a way to save the chat too.
Hmm.
Um so there's a few things. Um
Okay. And somebody mentioned about when you were sharing the example of the fact that when you keep repeating information, it tends to stick. And somebody mentioned how, wow, that seems to be the biggest risk in social media. Can you talk a little bit
yes.
about that?
Yeah, it is. It's I think because again, like how fast it can things can can move is very difficult. And so that, yes, that it's a huge problem, and some platforms have tried like some different things. Some of them have tried things and then decided that they just, I guess, don't care anymore. But yeah, it's a definitely it's a feature and a bug of social media that it works that way.
Okay. Another question that just came in. How do you handle people that live in an echo chamber, in particular, media, podcasts, etc., directed right at them?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's where I think you have a little bit of a task is to are there some sources, like trying to identify if there's sources that you can share with them, and like what sources that you can share with them without them, having like a big negative reaction to them. Um, and and so I think that's where, trying to find like some common where the common ground is there. I um and I think so that's I mean it's very difficult, right? Like again, it's the same thing, like sort of they afford like how we're very insulated now. And it's a really difficult problem because researchers have actually done some looking at of like, well, what if we like force people to see things that like are opposite their viewpoint and like in their feeds. I think there was like something with happened with Facebook some years ago, and it didn't actually like work well at all, because people often had again like this so if it's something that's so contradictory to what that they're seeing, then they have like a very an immediately negative reaction to it. Um, so, um, so yeah, so I think going back to, if you are part of their, if you're part of their information environment, like what are some ways that you can introduce some other information, other sources to them to diversify things a bit and bring new perspectives and things. Yeah,
Okay.
it's just hard. It's all
Yeah,
hard stuff.
it's all hard stuff. Kind of on the same note of different sources, one person wanted to know how much of the deluge at this time is propaganda and how much of it does it fit into that classification?
Yeah. And I think that that's where so that's kind of depending on who you talk to, kind of what their academic kind of viewpoint is. Like some people call like, disinformation, propaganda, like can get really muddled, and it can be hard to tell the difference um between them. And again, it's sometimes it's you can you are like sometimes information can be traced back to a particular source that you're like, okay, well this is actually propaganda, it's political propaganda, it's a financial etc. um and it was created with a particular intent. Which, I would include like advertising as a type of propaganda, and like a very, using the term very like, broadly as well. Um, so I think it's hard to know. We have for it's hard to know for the end user, like you as a person in your information environment. Now, my colleagues at CAP have done some work where they do like they do trace stuff that circulates on social media, and then when things get picked up out offline as well. Right, because like information doesn't just stay online. It gets transferred to different mediums. And so they are able to map out like different networks of people and where things originate from. But again, a person online, oftentimes it's almost impossible to know what again the exact there I should say it's there's it's impossible to know like at first glance like where something is coming from. Like there are ways of like checking and on verifying online information. So I guess I want to be careful and not going like too far in extreme, but just so what I'm saying is like when you see something and you like see it initially on your phone, like you don't know, and you're like, that's not true. You can't at that one glance know is that disinformation or misinformation. But you can, there are steps to verify information, right? So I think that's want to make sure that's clear that and that really like a lot of the information we see online is like is true. Like it's not that, I also don't want to be giving the impression that like, everything you see online is mis or disinformation because there is a lot of true information out there. Um, and and I think that's what's also can be tricky too. And this is everything is things I saw a comment in the chat is even sources that you trust, information sources you trust, mess up. And so
Yes.
sometimes, and that happens because it's his real life. And so like I again like the source I've got my sources of things I read every day and I often can get very frustrated by the way that the headline is written because they're trying to get
Yeah.
clicks or I feel like that they're not covering a story that I think is important. So I think that that's also something that it's, and this has always been true. Um,
Mhm.
but I think it can sometimes, by how polarized it is right now with information sources, we can sometimes forget that. It gets lost in the conversation. And I guess to say, like like long time ago, like in the 30s and stuff, like information's like newspapers were like in the US were very much like, publicly aligned like with different political points of view. So there wasn't really like a, sort of like a neutral objective paper so much. So there's some similarities with the information, environment was, long time ago. But what's different now, of course, is just like the quantity of it and the speed and scale is something that's we've never seen before.
Mhm. And we did have numerous questions from a person in the chat. I'm going to highlight this one, and you touched on this a little bit about how to spot what could be misinformation in like the modern media, not necessarily just individuals on social media, but like from ma more what we would be considered mainstream sources. Um, and I think there is a conversation to be had there about checking your source, making sure that consider where that source is coming from as they report the story.
Yep. Yeah. And I think, I you probably have had this experience where when there is a like story that comes from like our area and like it makes it to the national news story. And when you read it from like a national, like a reporter, you will find like little mistakes in it. And you're like, well, that's not right. And, because again, somebody's coming in trying to, so there's lots of nuances and stuff here too. And why this, again, there's important to have, a wide variety of information sources, not only individually, but in a community, covering a communities. And yeah, because that's also can be hard to get. It's also just difficult in lots of different ways to making sure that the story as well can be represented. So yeah,
Yeah.
but that isn't because they made like a mistake. Maybe they like wrote the wrong town name or they made a reference to something like I don't know they called it Kings County instead of King County because they got it confused with the county in New York.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean the whole thing is incorrect, but it's just like an indicator that they don't know the community as well as like local reporter would.
hmm Um, I was wondering if you had any sources that could share on how I see the media bias check chart get circulated all the time or anything like that, maybe to share
Yeah.
deep spotted on things.
Yeah. I don't like that you saw me from my facial expression. I don't really like that
Yeah.
chart very much. I think it flattens things and just it again puts things into much of a box. And I don't, again, the scale that they use, I kind of like, I think I know. Unfortunately, we want to be able to do that as like a handy, like kind of check
Yeah.
and a guide, but I think things are just a lot more complicated than that. Um, so, um, so yeah, I think it's more, um, yeah, I think it's, some different news sources, different perspectives are important on things, and I don't think there's any one magic chart to rule them all sort of situation for who, what particular publication falls on what spectrum, and things change and, adjust all the time, and reporters are different, editors are different. The person who's converting the story to an online headline is different, which can change the potential perspective and slant on things. So, I did want to throw in the chat because I was talking about how you can verify online information. This is, of course, we didn't talk about this today, but this is we're actually at CIP working on a better like resource to teach SIFT. But SIFT is this method of verifying information online. That's I would recommend that if you're looking for a way to figure out if something's true or false if what you're seeing is online.
And I think that just answered this latest question that came in. Is there a checklist of ways someone can evaluate their source?
Yes. So yes, I would say yes, I would say SIFT there would be my thing. And I'm quickly trying to pull up if there is a because that one is pretty old, and it's got okay, this one looks pretty good here, real quick. This one's from it's got a little bit more kind of instructional support with some videos and stuff. So and then yeah, it's something that we're working on at CIP to have some like links that we can share first, because this comes up a lot, of course. But this is our preferred method of verifying online information.
Perfect. We did have somebody ask if AI is helping the situation or if it is creating a better lie. And before you answer, I would like to pitch that we had a topic about AI and misinformation, I think just last week, and I will put that in the chat in just a second. It is up on the library's YouTube. You can go watch it.
Yes, so I would recommend you do, because my colleague Jason did that and he's great. So yeah, it is, yes, is making things even more difficult. And I've noticed, actually, somebody pointed out to me, and then I've noticed it as well. And I start to go to Google image search and I search for images. A lot of the images that are popping up first are AI generated images. And, um, and sometimes you can kind of tell by looking, but then in a lot of cases, it's getting so good so quick that it's very difficult to tell any one person, being able to see with your own eyes, and really, like, if it's AI related to some, like, there was like an AI like picture of like like the Pope in a puffy coat that came, I think it was like last year or something. It's pretty fun AI generated picture. But again, so what I would do in that situation, if you see something that you're like, is this real? Is to use actually the SIFT method, which I said, or like, try to do a Google reverse image search to try to see what other sources are reporting on that particular photo. Of course, that's not like a cure-all for all situations, because sometimes things are made as like these, they aren't necessarily going to be like a news story about it, but it's something that you can do. But it's definitely a problem, increasing problem that there's not an easy solution to. Another non-easy solution, so problem without an easy solution.
Mhm. We did have some compliments about the sandwich method. Uh,
Excellent.
can we like bring that back up?
Yes, absolutely. So yes, I well, so this was Okay, sorry, it takes me a moment to do this. Um, and hold on, I'm gonna just turn my video off here and share real quick. Um, and where is that? Okay. All right. Oh, let me show the, so yeah, the eye. So this is, so I guess, so I'll let you take a look at it just a second.
Awesome.
So,
Thank you.
so, so yeah, this is, yeah, so based on the work of linguists and in this particular, I learned about this through a lesson from actually a misinformation curriculum that was developed for public libraries. So yeah, there's your truth sandwich, and I'm glad that it was helpful.
Okay, and I'm just checking again if there's any more questions. We do seem to be dwindling down a bit. Da, da, da. No, I think we are about ready to wrap up.
Great.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us. This video was recorded. It will be up on the library YouTube in a few days that you'll be able to watch it again. And we will also have the resources ready to share with all of you and anyone else who wasn't able to make it. Um, and that is it. All right.
Great.
Have a great rest of your night, everybody.
Bye. Thank y'all so much for joining. Have a good evening. Thank you to Snow Isle. Really appreciate y'all hosting us.
Thank you.